Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tochi. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. In the village of Itoko, where the sun often rose without hurry and set with a hush, there lived a girl whose hands bore more stories than her mouth ever told. Adana was her name, and even from her youth, the lines in her palm seemed to curve like the roots of trees, reaching down into the earth for something deeper than mere survival. The village lay between hills dressed in wild green, and the slow-moving Arashi River that curled like a sleeping serpent around its edge. Dusty paths separated clusters of mud houses, and in the mornings, cockcrows competed with the laughter of children carrying water jars on their heads. Adana walked these same paths with quiet feet, her shadow stretching before her like a whisper of the woman she would become. She was not born into wealth, nor was she favored by luck. Her parents, though once respected for their quiet decency, left her too soon. Her father's death was like a closed door no one had the key to open again. He had been a farmer, stubborn with the land, always saying the earth was a woman. You had to woo her with patience before she fed you. Her mother followed not long after, carried off by an illness the village could not name, and no prayer could cure. With their passing, Adana stood at 16 like a flame surrounded by cold winds, holding nothing but the land her father once tilled and a broken stool he had carved for her when she turned 10. It wasn't pity she wanted. All she sought was the strength to keep moving, even if it meant dragging her body through days that refused to be kind. The elders said she was too proud, but pride was the only blanket she had against the cold world. Every morning, before the dew had finished kissing the blades of elephant grass, Adana would wake to the sound of her own breath. No alarm clocks, no rooster needed, just the steady rhythm of necessity knocking on the door of her resolve. With a basket woven by her own hands and feet hardened by years of barefoot journeys, she would march into the bush paths to pick fallen mangoes, guavas, and the strange bitter plums that children loved to crack open with stones. What others ignored, she noticed. What they dismissed as waste, she treated as treasure. She began to dry pawpaws under iron trays set atop rocks, flipping them with precision, as though each slice was a page in her destiny. Then came the bananas, cut into neat rounds and placed like coins on raffia mats. The older women at the market would scoff, their wrappers tied high and arms folded, watching her with mild amusement. "Who go buy dry banana when fresh day?" one would mutter. Adana would just smile, her mouth silent but her eyes blazing with an answer she didn't yet have the words for. Her spot at the market was humble, just a square of fabric near the gutter, where the scent of roasted maize danced in the air. But people began to notice the neatness of her packaging, the taste of her dried fruits, and the way she always had change, no matter how small the coin. She didn't shout to sell. She didn't beg. She didn't even advertise. She let the quality of her effort speak, and speak it did, loud enough to find its way into the corners of small homes and the whispers between mothers washing clothes by the river. One day, a trader from Aramarai passed through Itoko and bought every piece of dried mango she had, asking if she could supply again. That was the first time Adana wrote her name in capital letters across a brown paper bag. That bag, crinkled and plain, was the beginning of something the village hadn't seen coming. The next 2 years came with the weight of both promise and pressure. Success, as they say, has many siblings, jealousy, exhaustion, responsibility, and doubt among them. With growing orders came growing demands. Adana, once a lone girl under a guava tree, began to employ younger village girls to help her peel and package. She taught them how to preserve sweetness without sugar, how to slice fruit with the same rhythm as a lullaby, and how to treat each product as if it would be eaten by a king. She borrowed a small loan from a retired schoolteacher in the next village, promising to pay it back in jars of guava jam if money ever failed. With the money, She bought her first sealing machine, a rusting contraption that spat sparks when overworked, but did its job. Her home became her factory, the backyard her warehouse. Chickens walked between baskets of drying fruit, and the scent of pineapple would linger on her wrappers, clinging to her even in church. She built without blueprint, worked without complaint. The village began to notice her absence more than her presence. If she missed market day, people asked. If she arrived late, eyes followed her with curiosity now laced with respect. Men began to offer advice cloaked in flirtation. You need a man to help you expand, they would say, but she would just nod, not agreeing, not disagreeing, only walking past them like a breeze that couldn't be caught. Adana never laughed much, but she smiled often, and always with her eyes, as though measuring what people said against what they meant. In her silence was strategy, in her calm, a kind of thunder. Not all seasons yielded joy. Some months the sun scorched her fruits faster than expected, ruining whole batches. Other times rain flooded her compound, washing away sacks of dried pawpaw that had taken weeks to prepare. But each time adversity knocked, she opened the door with both hands and faced it like an old friend. When she lacked fruit, she created jam. When she ran out of jars, she bartered with the local palm wine seller for empty bottles. The village might not have known the name for what she was doing, but somewhere beyond the hills, the word was entrepreneurship. Still, Adana never used it. She only said, "I'm trying my best." As she grew, so did her boundaries. She started supplying to schools and health centers, promoting fruit as food, not just snack. One headmaster called her a visionary. She didn't know what it meant at first, but she liked how it sounded when he said it. She began to keep a notebook, lines filled with her own ideas, designs for future packaging, sketches of what she wanted her logo to look like. She prayed over the pages at night, whispering scriptures into the ink, as if to bind heaven to her plans. "Commit thy works unto the Lord, and thy thoughts shall be established," she once muttered over her notes, Proverbs 16 verse 3, written in her mother's old handwriting. It was in those quiet, oil lamplit nights that the true Adana was born, not just the fruit seller, but the builder, the woman who could see a company inside a slice of mango. Her hands had moved from tilling soil to tilling destiny, and not even she knew how far the harvest would reach. It was during the season when the mango trees began dropping their fruit before they ripened that Chuka first walked into Adana's story, not like a storm, not like fire, but like a shadow cast by something you didn't see coming. He arrived with a dusty bag slung over one shoulder and a calmness that clung to him like his faded navy shirt. There was nothing flashy about him, no loud voice, no fancy slippers, just steady eyes and lips that curled upward more often than not. Adana didn't notice him at first. To her, he was just another young man from the next town, one of the many applicants she had started interviewing as her business took in more orders than her small team could manage. His application was filled with neat writing and humble claims, delivery driving, inventory handling, minor repairs. There was a small note scribbled at the bottom in brackets, "Willing to learn anything." That caught her eye more than anything else. She gave him a week's trial. He didn't talk much the first 3 days, only nodded and followed instructions like someone who'd grown up knowing how to be overlooked. But on the 4th day, when he managed to fix the jam sealing machine using wire and coconut oil, Adana took mental note of him. She didn't show it in her face, but she watched from behind the wooden partition that separated her office from the factory floor. She noticed how he greeted every worker with respect, how he carried 2 sacks when most men struggled with one, and how, when he smiled, it was never at the expense of silence. There was a kind of patience in Chuka that unsettled her, not because it was dangerous, but because it was rare. She began noticing him more, not because she intended to, but because he had a way of becoming part of a space without disturbing it. He would linger around during closing hours, sweeping the yard even after everyone had left. Sometimes he would whistle softly, tunes without rhythm, but they carried a strange peace. One day, Adana had forgotten her keys inside the back office. It was nearing dusk, and the wind was starting to hum through the leaves with that eerie sound it makes when the spirits of the evening begin to stretch their legs. Chuka appeared with the spare key. No explanation how he found it. No boasting. Just handed it over with a nod. "I noticed you always drop it by the windowsill," he said, and walked away. That night, Adana didn't sleep easily. She found herself staring at the cracks in her ceiling, wondering why such a simple gesture lingered in her thoughts like perfume on old clothes. Over the next few weeks, they spoke more, mostly about work, deadlines, shipments, late suppliers. But in between the work talk were small interruptions. Chuka would say something like, "Your staff respect you, not because you pay them well, but because you see them." Or, "Most people build to be seen, but you build because it's in your blood." Words like those sat inside her long after he left the room. She didn't remember the last time someone saw her beyond her output. The village saw her as Adana the fruit woman. Traders saw her as a business link. Even her workers, though loyal, treated her with that stiff courtesy reserved for bosses. But Chuka, he looked at her like she was human first, and that did something to her defenses. The friendship, if one could call it that, grew in slow circles. They never declared it, never named it, but it showed in small, repeated things. When she brought food to the factory floor, she would always pack an extra portion, pretending it was a mistake. He would always eat it, never questioning her reasons. When it rained and the paths turned to muddy rivers, he'd appear at her door with clean palm slippers, muttering, "These are sturdier." She never asked how he knew her size. And when the other workers teased them with quiet chuckles and knowing glances, Adana neither denied nor explained. She wasn't a girl anymore. She didn't blush. But her heart, once stiff from years of being its own guardian, began to soften. One night, they were both working late, trying to correct a misprinted batch of labels for a guava order. The generator had gone off, and they lit a lantern to continue. The silence between them felt natural. Then he looked at her fully, like a man who had reached a decision, and said, "You're the kind of woman people write stories about, but I just want to live beside you." She said nothing at first. Words felt too big for her throat. But something in her shifted. A gate that had rusted shut for years creaked open just enough to let light in. And from that moment on, they began to walk toward something unspoken but deeply understood. They didn't call it love. Not yet. But the seed had been planted. When they eventually declared it, there were no fireworks, no village gathering, no announcement after Sunday service. It happened like everything else between them, quietly, with both feet on the ground. He asked her to walk with him to the riverbank one evening after work. The sky wore a heavy orange, and the water flowed with the laziness of a thing that had no place to be. They sat on a low rock near the edge, the same spot where her father once taught her to skip stones. Chuka turned to her, his voice low but firm, and said, "You carry everything, this business, this village, your past. I don't want to take anything from you. I just want to carry something beside you." It wasn't a proposal, not yet. But it was a promise. Adana felt something in her loosen, like a knot finally untied. They sat there until the mosquitoes found them, laughing about things they hadn't lived yet. Marriage came later, after months of shared silences, intertwined routines, and whispered prayers. Adana had always told herself she was too focused to love. But when she finally said yes to Chuka, she said it not from a place of blindness, but clarity. She had watched him, studied him, waited, and now she believed he was the one person who didn't just understand her struggle, but respected the soil from which she rose. The wedding was small, just family, elders, and laughter beneath the old almond tree. She wore a simple wrapper, and he wore a white caftan. The wind blew soft that day, as though even the weather knew to be gentle. The early days of their marriage passed like a slow-burning candle, quiet, steady, and unassuming. Adana had never pictured herself as a wife, not because she rejected the idea, but because she never had the time or luxury to imagine anything outside survival. Yet, waking beside Chuka in the mornings became a rhythm she didn't resist. He was respectful, helpful, even tender when the mood called for it. He would rise early, sometimes before her, and sweep the compound with soft strokes of the broom as if afraid to wake the spirits. She found comfort in his routine, the way he folded wrappers, his humming while preparing hot water, how he always brought back garden eggs from the market, even when she didn't ask. But slowly, something in the air began to change. It started with his tone during discussions about the business. Where once he used to listen, now he interrupted. Where once he offered suggestions, now he gave instructions. Subtle, but there. At first, she thought it was confidence. Perhaps marriage had given him a sense of belonging that emboldened him. She even welcomed it. Maybe now I won't have to do everything alone, she had once joked to a friend. But as the days lengthened, so did the shadows in his eyes. One day, she overheard him telling a delivery team, "Make sure this is handled properly. We can't afford mistakes, not with my name on the company now." His name? Adana said nothing, but that line curled around her spine like a cold rope. It wasn't said to provoke her, and maybe that's what made it more unsettling. He said it because he believed it. It was during a quarterly meeting with her factory staff that the shift became undeniable. Chuka had begun attending them, not as a supportive spouse, but as a man who expected to be listened to. He would walk in late, greet no one, then sit beside Adana as though he had earned that seat by merit. When staff raised concerns, he'd wave them off or interrupt Adana mid-sentence to suggest better alternatives. The room, once filled with open voices and collaborative energy, became heavy with hesitation. People watched him before they spoke. They watched her too, waiting for her to reestablish the balance. But Adana, still trying to hold the rope in both directions, smiled through the discomfort and said nothing. Her silence was not weakness. It was calculation. She had built her business on patience and prayer. But even patience has its thresholds, and prayers unanswered often echo like hollow drums. At home, he grew bolder in his criticisms. "You're too soft on your workers," he'd say while eating the food she cooked. "You should learn to be firm. They take you for granted." There was a time his words came from a place of concern, but now they came sharp, as though dipped in vinegar. One night, after a long day where machinery had failed and a shipment got delayed, Adana sat on the kitchen floor, exhausted. Chuka entered and, without asking what was wrong, launched into a rant about how she needed better management skills. "Sometimes I wonder if you're even fit to lead this anymore," he muttered, not loudly, but clear enough. She stared at him, her heart not broken but bruised. That night, for the first time since her father died, she cried while hiding her face from the moon. The bruises were never on her skin. They lived in the folds of her spirit. Chuka had a way of saying things that didn't scream but still pierced. "You're lucky I'm here" became a regular phrase. "If not for me, who would even take you seriously outside this village?" he'd say while flipping through papers she prepared. The worst part wasn't the words. It was how calmly he said them, as if they were facts, not insults. Adana, who had wrestled drought, rejection, ridicule, and sleeplessness to build Adana Foods from dried mango peels and iron-sealed sachets, found herself questioning her worth, not as a businesswoman, but as a woman. Was she too hard to love? Too obsessed with work? Too proud? These questions haunted her even in prayer. She'd kneel at night and whisper, "Lord, is this the price of love?" But heaven, in its silence, gave no answer she could cling to. Even the workers noticed the change. They still greeted her with respect, still smiled when she passed, but they had grown cautious around Chuka. They no longer spoke freely when he entered the room. They no longer asked questions in meetings. Instead, they whispered after he left, saying things like, "This one wants to wear the crown without knowing where the kingdom came from." One evening, her oldest employee, Mama Keiji, cornered her and said, "My daughter, The tongue that cannot be controlled will burn the house it eats from. Adana said nothing, but she heard it, and the truth, once spoken, begins to dig its own well. Her quiet observations became a habit. She started paying attention to things she used to overlook. Chuka had begun spending more time outside the house, claiming to be handling logistics or managing operations with clients from other villages. But receipts stopped matching expenses. Deliveries ran late. Workers reported conflicting instructions. Adana, who once trusted his every move, found herself second-guessing everything. One night, he returned late and half-drunk, which was unlike him. She asked no questions. She simply offered him water, tucked her doubts beneath her pillow, and watched him fall asleep, as if the day hadn't bled her dry. She began writing things down. Dates, times, changes in attitude. Not out of pettiness, but protection. Somewhere inside her, the seed of suspicion had begun to germinate, and though she tried to pray it away, its roots stretched deep. She remembered her father once told her, not all storms come with thunder. Some wear slippers, and Chuka, she realized, had worn his slippers well. She still cooked, still worked, still smiled in public. But her spirit had begun retreating from him, folding itself in layers only she could understand. Love, as she had learned, wasn't always about how someone entered your life. Sometimes it was about how they changed the room once they stood inside it. And Chuka, who once entered gently like the evening breeze, now roamed her life like a man who had mistaken ownership for partnership. Her silence deepened, not because she didn't have words, but because she was gathering strength. And in that silence, she waited not for proof, but for peace to return to her chest. There are moments in life when the truth doesn't shout. It whispers through little cracks that ordinary eyes often miss. That's how it started for Adana, quiet, lingering clues that refused to disappear, even when she tried to blink them away. The days felt heavier, not from labor, but from an invisible burden she could no longer name. Chuka had become a ghost in his own home, present in body, but absent in spirit. He came home late more frequently, smelling faintly of perfume that didn't belong to her or the factory. She once noticed a strand of hair, a golden brown curl, resting on his shirt collar, and though she said nothing, something within her shifted. His excuses were sharp and convenient, always dressed in just enough logic to silence suspicion. I had to drive down to AMU for a last-minute delivery. The truck broke down again. I had to wait for a mechanic. I stayed with Keen. We were working on the new supply contract. One excuse melted into another like ice on warm stone, but the water left behind began forming puddles that could no longer be ignored. Adana, who had always moved by instinct, began listening more to the stillness. There's a kind of silence that speaks louder than noise, and her nights were now full of it. The bed they once shared no longer felt like rest. It felt like pretense, a place where backs turned and hearts folded inward. Still, she held her peace. Not out of fear, not even out of love, but because the woman she had become had learned that some battles require waiting, not war cries. It was a Tuesday, just after the rain had made the roads in Itoko slippery and unkind, when the veil finally lifted. She had gone to the warehouse unannounced, hoping to surprise the staff with crates of roasted yam and palm oil for their efforts that month. She carried the food herself, as she always had, in 2 large trays wrapped with white cloth. As she walked through the back entrance of the facility, the usual hum of machines was missing. It was quiet, too quiet for that time of day. She followed the corridor that led to the storage room and paused when she heard laughter. Not the laughter of workers on break. It was different, light, flirtatious, and undeniably intimate. The voice was female, smooth like pawpaw flesh. And then she heard his. Chuka's voice, softer than she'd heard it in months, laced with amusement. She froze. For a moment, her hands forgot how to carry, and one tray tilted, spilling a few slices of yam onto the floor. She bent to pick them up but couldn't move. Instead, she placed both trays on the nearest bench and walked silently toward the sound. The crates were stacked high, forming narrow alleys between them. She stepped into one, and there, hidden behind tall boxes of bottled guava juice, was her husband, standing close, too close, to one of the interns. A girl no older than 20, wearing a top too tight for the work assigned. Her back was turned, but Adana could see the way she leaned in. Chuka's hand rested on the girl's lower back, fingers moving in slow circles. He whispered something that made her giggle, and then he kissed her, not passionately, but carelessly, as though it wasn't the first time. Adana didn't speak. She didn't gasp. She simply turned and walked out, her shoes echoing against the concrete like stones tossed into a still river. When she reached the compound, she didn't cry. Not then. The yam and palm oil were still sitting by the bench, untouched. A lizard darted across her path, and in that small moment, she remembered a proverb her mother used to say, "The lizard that falls from the tree nods not in shame, but in survival." She walked home slowly, as if measuring the steps between innocence and truth. By the time she reached her compound, the clouds had begun to gather again, heavy with the promise of another rain. She didn't go inside immediately. Instead, she sat beneath the mango tree, the same one where she and Chuka had once shared laughter and roasted corn, the same tree that had heard secrets and soaked in dreams. The branches swayed above her, indifferent to her grief. That was where the tears came, not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and steady, like a leaking roof in the dead of night. It wasn't just the betrayal that pierced her. It was the realization that she had been slowly erased from her own story. The man who once spoke like a partner had reduced her to a background character in the life she built with her bare hands. Her fingers, once strong from peeling fruits and sealing packs, now trembled as they wiped her cheeks. Still, she made no noise. There are some wounds too deep for sound. When the first drops of rain finally fell, she welcomed them. Let them mix with her tears. Let them wash the soil where her heartbreak had just been buried. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she spent hours pacing her small sitting room, thinking not of revenge, but of recovery. Her thoughts were not chaotic. They were focused, organized like rows of fruit arranged for market display. By dawn, she had drawn up a new mental list, not for production, not for shipping, but for consequences. She was not a woman who acted out of impulse. She was a woman who measured fire before adding fuel. And now, the flame had arrived. She called her assistant first thing in the morning and asked for a private meeting with legal. Then she called in her finance lead to request every transaction Chuka had signed off on in the past 3 months. She asked for shift records, vehicle logs, and warehouse keys. She spoke little. She moved with precision. She didn't even mention what she had seen. That would come later. For now, she was gathering not evidence, but her power. The workers sensed something had changed. Her walk was firmer. Her eyes no longer held the weight of confusion, but the clarity of decision. And yet, when Chuka returned home that evening, greeting her with his usual forced charm, she smiled and handed him his food. She even asked how his day went. He lied again, effortlessly, and she nodded just once, as though agreeing with something he didn't know she already knew. She waited until he finished eating. Then she collected the plate, washed it herself, dried it, and placed it back in the cupboard. It was her last act of service. That night, as Chuka snored beside her, unaware of the storm that had begun to gather inside her soul, Adana lay awake, eyes open, heart still, and whispered the only prayer she had left. Lord, give me the wisdom to end this like a woman who remembers where she came from. Morning in Itoko arrived without grandeur. The sun did not shout as it rose. It merely stretched itself across the sky like a tired child wiping sleep from its eyes. Adana was already awake, long before the cock had stirred. She didn't make tea or boil yam or light the stove. She sat at the edge of the bed and stared at her hands. Those hands that had built a company, carried baskets heavier than her weight, fed people who now fed others, and once held Chuka like he was something sacred. Now those same hands felt empty, not weak, but ready. Her calm was unsettling, even to herself. It was the kind of calm a woman reaches when pain has already done its worst and there's nothing left to fear. She went to her prayer mat not to beg, not to plead, but to thank. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, "because I survived what was meant to shatter me." Then she stood up, tied her wrapper tight across her waist like armor, and began moving through the house like a woman on a mission. She pulled out her old ledgers and cross-checked them with new accounts. There were inconsistencies that had previously seemed too small to matter, but now stood out like stains on white linen. Money unaccounted for. Fuel claims that exceeded transport logs. Goods lost in transit under Chuka's supervision. Everything was beginning to align, not just emotionally, but factually. She made no noise, called no names, and asked no questions. Instead, she began closing in, inch by inch, signature by signature. She was no longer searching for truth. She already knew it. What she wanted now was closure. Not the one that came with tears and apologies, but the kind that stands tall in a room and commands justice. When the day of reckoning arrived, it arrived like dry harmattan wind, sharp, silent, and inescapable. She chose a Thursday, a busy day, but not overwhelming. Enough staff were present to bear witness, but not so many as to turn the office into a stage. She called for a full administrative meeting at noon, under the pretense of policy changes and factory audits. Chuka came in late, as usual, adjusting his shirt collar and offering a lazy apology with that familiar smirk he wore when he thought he still held power. He sat beside her, legs crossed, confident, unaware. Adana stood and addressed the staff with grace that didn't shake. She thanked them for their work, acknowledged the challenges of growth, then moved with delicate ease into the matter at hand. "We've noticed some inconsistencies in our logistics and operations, some deliveries unaccounted for, some supplier transactions incomplete. I have here," she raised a folder, "the breakdown of all operations overseen by Mr. Chuka between the last quarter and now." Her voice didn't rise, but the room held its breath. Chuka shifted in his seat. She continued, laying out the facts one by one: invoice numbers, missing product counts, falsified transport logs. She passed copies to her assistant, who handed them around like church bulletins. "We operate on trust here," Adana said, eyes on no one, yet piercing everyone. "But when trust is broken, it must be addressed. Today, I am dissolving all operational responsibilities held by Mr. Chuka. Effective immediately, he is no longer part of Adana Foods in any capacity." Silence clung to the walls like dust. Chuka opened his mouth to object, but she raised her hand slightly, not to silence him, but to remind him that his time to speak had expired. His words hung dry in his throat, and he swallowed them like spoiled soup. That same afternoon, she summoned the delivery unit and removed his name from the payroll. She contacted the warehouse supervisor and revoked his access. She called the company's main suppliers, some of whom she had once introduced to Chuka herself, and told them that all further communication should go directly through her or her newly appointed logistics head. There was no anger in her tone, only finality. She moved with the elegance of someone who had nothing to prove, yet everything to reclaim. Then she walked into the finance office and closed the informal credit line she had granted his mother's provision shop in Amurka, a quiet act of generosity she had kept under wraps for 3 years. No announcement. Just a call. "Stop extending supplies to Mamangidika's store. She will now have to purchase at market rates." It was not revenge. It was correction. Every stitch she pulled had been one he'd sewn carelessly, thinking the fabric was his to tear. Even his younger brother, who had worked under the packaging department through her mercy, was relieved of his post that week. The HR head was instructed to issue an official release, along with compensation for days served, but no promise of return. Adana didn't boast. She didn't stand tall with pride. She simply did what needed to be done. Because betrayal, she had learned, is not only personal, it's professional. And in business, when the wrong seed is found in the soil, you uproot it before it poisons the field. Chuka didn't take it well. The mask cracked quickly. He tried to confront her at home the next morning, his voice a mixture of disbelief and wounded ego. "You think you can just throw me out? After everything I've done for you?" He barked, slamming the front gate with the recklessness of a man cornered. She met his fury with something stronger than rage: silence. The kind that doesn't blink, doesn't shake, doesn't respond. He paced, ranted, threatened. "I'll go to the elders. I'll expose you. I'll drag your name through the mud." She looked at him, calm as water in a clay pot, and replied, "Then make sure you bring soap for yourself, because you'll need it too." That silenced him more than anything else. For a moment he stood still, perhaps realizing that the woman before him was not the same one he had married. She had changed, not in body, not in tone, but in spirit. She no longer argued to prove herself. She no longer needed to justify her actions. She simply enforced them. That afternoon, he packed his things. Not everything, just what he could carry in a borrowed sack. No one in the compound greeted him. No one looked his way. It was as though he had never existed there. Word traveled fast, not because she spread it, but because people saw the shift and respected it. Some even whispered prayers for her under their breath. But Adana didn't want sympathy. She only wanted peace. And peace, she finally realized, doesn't always come from quiet. Sometimes it comes from the sound of a door closing behind the one who never valued it in the first place. Morning returned to Atoko with its usual hush, the kind of stillness that only those who have been broken and rebuilt can truly appreciate. Adana stood by her window, watching the soft rustle of the mango leaves, their motion subtle, like hands waving goodbye to something that once mattered but no longer held weight. The absence of Chuka did not echo in the house like a missing sound. It was more like a room that had been properly swept after years of gathering dust. Clean, clear, whole. She had not spoken much to anyone since the day he left, nor did she need to. The ones who knew her didn't require words to understand the shift, and the ones who didn't were smart enough not to pry. Healing, for Adana, wasn't loud or performative. It was made up of small things. Waking up and boiling tea, sitting under the mango tree without flinching, listening to workers laugh again without wondering if someone was laughing at her. Each morning she stepped into her office and saw that no storm had shaken her building, no betrayal had undone her foundation. She gained another layer of peace. She replaced her curtains, not because the old ones were worn out, but because the sunlight felt different now, and she wanted her space to reflect the new light that had entered her life. There were no late-night confrontations, no apologies mailed in envelopes, no unexpected returns with suitcases full of remorse. Chuka left the same way he entered, quietly and on his own terms. But it was Adana who chose to remain, and that choice held more power than anything else she had ever built. The village responded not with gossip, but with curiosity wrapped in respect. Elders who once watched her from afar began greeting her with more intention, as though they finally saw the woman behind the business. The market women, once hesitant to speak freely around her, now leaned into her presence like sunflowers chasing light. One afternoon, while selecting plantains at the corner of Mama Yuzoma's stall, a woman whispered, "You walked through fire, and you didn't even smell of smoke." Adana smiled, not to affirm it, but to acknowledge the truth she now carried in her bones. There was something unexplainable about a woman who had stared heartbreak in the eye and did not blink. That kind of strength doesn't shout, it hums through every step she takes. Her company flourished in ways even she hadn't anticipated. Orders doubled. Clients from larger cities began calling, not just for her products, but to invite her to share her story at trade events. She declined most of them, not because she feared the spotlight, but because she understood now that her story wasn't for spectacle. It was for a purpose. She began investing more time in mentoring the young women who worked with her, not as a boss, but as a guide. She taught them how to recognize red flags in contracts and conversations, how to speak their minds without disrespect, and how to understand their worth beyond the love of any man. It was her way of planting seeds, not the kind that bore fruit for sale, but the kind that bore women who would one day stand on their own land and not be afraid. The mango tree and her compound became a place of peace again, though it took time. There were days when she sat beneath it, not thinking of the past, but simply breathing into the present. Birds would gather there often, especially in the evenings when the wind cooled and the sky wore that tired orange hue. She would bring her chair, a glass of water, and a book, sometimes to read, sometimes just to hold. Her workers had started calling it Madam's thinking place, and though they joked, none of them approached her when she was there. It was an unspoken agreement. The tree had witnessed too much to become ordinary. It had been the background of betrayal and now stood as the landmark of restoration. Adana often found herself reflecting on the strange rhythm of life, how something that once shaded her love now covered her solitude. But she never cursed the tree. Instead, she prayed beneath it. Not always in words, sometimes just in gratitude. She had returned to herself, whole. Her faith, tested and pulled at from every angle, had not dissolved, it had deepened. She remembered scriptures that once carried her through darker seasons, especially the ones she now kept tucked into the back of her notebook. The Lord is near to the broken-hearted and saves the crushed in spirit. Those words felt truer now than ever, not because they were written, but because she had lived them. She had not only survived, she had thrived in spite of the wound, not because the pain was beautiful, but because she refused to let it define her. On a day no different from others, when the clouds hung lazily and the village buzzed with its usual rhythm of footsteps and chatter, a young girl named Ojeki, barely 20, approached Adana in the factory yard. She had just joined the team, eyes wide with dreams, but still unsure of her place in the world. She hesitated before speaking, then said, "Madam, how do you know when it's time to let someone go?" Adana turned to her slowly, studying her face, not judging, just listening. Then she answered in a voice that felt as soft as cloth soaked in water, yet heavy with truth. "When staying starts to kill the part of you that used to smile, you go. Not out of hate, but because joy must be protected." The girl didn't reply. She nodded slowly, then turned back to her post. Adana remained there, hands in her wrapper, eyes lifted toward the sky. She didn't need to say more. Her life, her presence, her endurance had already spoken enough. She walked back into her office, picked up a folder marked with new distribution plans, and returned to work. There were still fruits to dry, jars to seal, and orders to fulfill. Her life had not ended with Chuka's departure. It had only reset. She wasn't chasing happiness now. She was walking with it hand in hand on the same path she had carved from broken ground. Her name, once nearly silenced under someone else's pride, now rang louder than ever, without needing to shout. And in that quiet, in that clarity, Adana found the kind of peace that no man could give and no storm could steal. If you followed Adana's journey from the dust of hardship to the grace of healing, then you already know this was more than just a tale. It was a mirror, a quiet reminder, a seed of truth. Never shrink yourself for someone who doesn't know your worth. If someone enters your life and starts rearranging your piece, making you question your value, or trying to wear your crown like they earned it, pause. Look again. Protect what you've built, whether it's your dreams, your dignity, or your voice. Love is beautiful, but it is not blind. Trust is precious, but it is not foolish. And silence is powerful, but it must not be mistaken for weakness. You were not created to be buried inside someone else's ego. You were created to grow, to shine, to rise, even if it means rising alone. Like Adana, never be afraid to start over. Starting over doesn't mean you failed, it means you refuse to settle. And now, let us pray. We thank you for the strength you plant in the hearts of women and men who refuse to be broken by betrayal. We bless you for the wisdom you give to those who do not fight with noise, but walk in grace and power. We honor you because, like Adana, you allow us to lose the wrong people to find the right version of ourselves. Lord, for every listener who has ever been bruised in silence, restore their voice. For every soul who has cried under mango trees of disappointment, give them laughter beneath the same branches. For every person carrying the weight of disrespect, wipe it off their shoulders and crown them with dignity. For those still stuck in situations that dim their light, Father, pull them out gently but firmly. Remind them that peace is not a privilege, it's a right. And for those who've been taken for granted, may they be reintroduced in seasons where they are celebrated, not tolerated. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.